Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Geography Colloquium. My name is Adriana Gonzalez, and Jovan is unfortunately out sick today, so I'm playing Jovan today. Um, but I'm a second year PhD student here at Cal, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Caribbean Coalition at Berkeley. And today it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our colloquium speaker for today, Dr. Ryan Cecil Jobson. Professor Jobson is a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Professor of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. He is also the Director of Doctoral Studies for UChicago's Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization. Dr. Jobson's research and teaching engage issues of energy and extractivism, states and sovereignty, technology and infrastructure, climate and crisis, race and capital. Ryan is also a dear mentor and colleague, and undoubtedly one of the biggest reasons I stand before you as a PhD student today. Over the past 6 years, he has nurtured my political and intellectual commitment to the ordinary people of the Caribbean and their powerful histories of place-based formations of self-governance. Today, Dr. Jobson will talk to us about his first book manuscript, The Petro-State Masquerade, coming out next month. The Petro-State Masquerade is a historical ethnography and materialist account of the relationship between fossil fuels and political power in Trinidad and Tobago, situated within the geographic specificities, colonial histories, and post-colonial predicaments of the archipelago. Excavating more than a century of commercial oil, gas, and petrochemical development, Jobson examines the contours of domination and resistance, theorizing how the tenuous relationship between hydrocarbons and political power, enshrined in the hyphenated form of the Petro-State, is upheld through a masquerade of permanence, sustained by speculative offshore and deepwater extraction. This book and this talk come at a critical time, as the habitability of the Caribbean is threatened by austerity, climate change, ecological collapse, and political leadership that flouts these existential threats. Professor Jobson insists that the survival of the Caribbean people requires us to intervene in the Petro-State Masquerade to play masquerades of our own. A committed scholar of CLR James, Dr. Jobson urges us to look to the streets for models of political life, placemaking, and power beyond extraction, not to the palaces and state houses. On behalf of the Geography Department, the Caribbean Coalition at Berkeley, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Cecil Jobson.
Over here. Good afternoon, everyone. I wasn't nervous until Adriana gave that incredible introduction. It's different when it's coming from one of your own students, but all that is to say that very proud of the work that you continue to do. I'm very proud of the community that you've made here at Berkeley, and it's a real pleasure to actually be here in Berkeley for the first time. So thank you for having me. Just a few words about this project before I sort of launch into my remarks today. I'm going to be talking primarily from the third chapter of this manuscript, but also gesturing out to some of the other sections that I hope we can discuss a bit in Q&A. But this emerges out of more than 10 years of archival research and primary fieldwork in Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of this emerges out of a concern for the political futures of the Caribbean, particularly vis-a-vis sort of resource and extractive futures. A sort of personal note to this is that my family worked in the bauxite industry in Jamaica. And in a lot of ways, the sort of crisis in that industry that emerged in the 1970s was always paralleled by Trinidad as a success story of sort of resource nationalism and sowing extractive futures. So a lot of this is actually about my journey and coming to terms with what exactly is the Trinbagonian Petro-State, what is the Petro-State form more broadly. And again, just to sort of speak to a bit of what Adriana made reference to, the masquerade is a critical framing here that I'll get into, and in this talk is primarily about the state's masquerade, or what I'm calling the state's masquerade. There also are sort of masquerades in the Carnivalesque Caribbean tradition that emerge from below, and they take the form of both sort of the Carnival Road March, but also general strikes, roadblocks, all kinds of ordinary interruptions of the state's semiotic scripts, or what I'm calling a masquerade. So I'm very excited again to be talking about the book as a finished object for the first time here with you all today. And I look forward to the discussion that we get to have afterwards as well. No further ado. On March 29th, 2012, Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar announced the discovery of 48 million barrels of oil in the waters off the western coast of Trinidad. Brandishing 2 large jars of unrefined crude to the press corps in attendance, she christened the find as a Jubilee discovery in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of political independence in the former British Crown colony. Moreover, on the eve of a national holiday celebrating the spiritual Baptist faith community, Persad-Bissessar reasoned that the discovery did not happen by accident, but instead by divine intervention. She did not give thanks to Olokun, the Baptist Orisha of material wealth and guardian of the ocean depths, however. Instead, she rehearsed the familiar adage, God is a Trini. Carried to victory in 2010 by a multiracial coalition of opposition parties, trade unions, and civil society organizations, Persad-Bissessar had campaigned on a pledge to wrangle the spoils of the Petro-State from entrenched political elites. In turn, she feted the oil find for its impending windfall to finance development projects such as highways, hospitals, and recreational facilities proposed for pivotal electoral constituencies. Her message of deliverance landed as she intended, as a proclamation of divine blessing and nationalist patrimony. God is a Trini often accompanies moments of collective good fortune. Invoked to punctuate the nation's world-famous carnival, its fortuitous location outside the Caribbean hurricane belt, or the success of its athletes in international sport. In this instance, the Prime Minister extolled the blessings of oil to reverse the tides of a flagging energy sector. At a moment of uncertainty, miraculous resolution arrived in the form of offshore hydrocarbons. God, indeed, was a Trini. Commercial development of crude oil in Trinidad began in 1908 and persisted in the remaining decades of colonial rule. Oil and its derivatives continued to propel the national economy in the decades after independence in 1962. But in the new millennium, oil production declined with the exhaustion of proven reserves and a slowdown in exploration and production activity. In 2005, crude oil production reached a peak daily average of just over 150,000 barrels per day before descending to its current output of less than 60,000. Seemingly, this Jubilee discovery tendered relief for Persad-Bissessar and her People's Partnership Coalition government. Despite the discovery, commercial success proved elusive. After her announcement, Persad-Bissessar's government contracted a Mexican shipping firm for an offshore production facility at a cost of 1.25 million US dollars. After the funds were dispensed from the public treasury, the contract remained unfulfilled, and the rig never arrived. As the offshore reserves lay dormant, benchmark crude prices peaked north of $100 per barrel in June 2014, before dropping steadily to prices below $45 by the following January. This also happened to be the time when I was doing my primary fieldwork in Trinidad. The development projects championed by her government were not immune to the negative shocks. The 2015 national budget, initially pegged to an anticipated crude oil price of $80, deflated rapidly as the market spiral compelled a revised budget staked to a price of US $45 a barrel. Nevertheless, in her performance, Persad-Bissessar concealed the protracted period between the moment of discovery and the production of first oil. If, as anthropologist Doug Rogers and my former committee member contends, social scientific interest in oil gained steam alongside boom markets for fossil fuels, it should come as little surprise that the perceived legitimacy of petrostates positively correlates with upswings in oil prices. Boom markets and state windfalls reinforce the hyphenated relation of hydrocarbons and state power that we know as the Petro-State. By conflating the materiality of oil with oil money, state legitimacy is consolidated through public expenditures on civic works and social programs. Oil busts, conversely, are associated with fiscal crises and social disintegration. As the spectacle of oil wealth wanes alongside the contraction of markets or the depletion of reserves, the state seemingly is no longer taken for granted as a spectacular body that is suspended above society. By this token, her staging of an oil discovery underscores sovereignty as a performance directed toward an audience of subjects. The peculiar resilience of the Petro-State form in periods of low market prices demands greater scrutiny, though. In Trinidad, the renaissance in North American onshore production, the shale revolution, curbed longstanding trade circuits with the United States as a primary export market. As energy multinationals turned to lucrative frontiers elsewhere, including in Guyana, so Anna, you can speak to that as well. A decline in oil production and shortfall in natural gas supplies imperiled ancillary industries such as refining, liquid natural gas, steel, and ammonia production that require crude oil or natural gas as a feedstock. While shallow water finds provided short-term relief through the exploitation of gas reserves, petrochemical and refining facilities continued to operate below capacity and curb profit margins for the state and its partners. In this landscape of insecurity, the immense potential of the deepwater sector proffered a remedy for diminishing state coffers and for sputtering onshore industries. Indeed, innovations in extractive technology sparked a revolution in deep water activity that now accounts for more than 10% of global oil production. Deepwater ventures feature prohibitive costs and a lower probability of success compared to conventional and shale production. Their risks are further exacerbated by long production cycles that typically comprise several years between the initial leasing of offshore blocks and the first oil and gas. And I want to explain here that this map is of Trinidad's maritime acreage. Each of these blocks that are set off is one that can be offered up for multinational leases through what's usually called bid rounds. Here you'll see anything that is sort of filled in a brighter color has been leased out to a particular multinational company, whereas this sort of light blue, all of these are unleased. So they haven't actually been sort of accepted for a bid to be explored by a multinational company. So the immense potential of deep water discoveries, which in some instances exceed 1 billion barrels of crude oil, nonetheless continue to attract multinational interests despite their cumulative risks. Beginning with an initial bid round for deepwater acreage in 1998, state officials championed the productive potential of Trinidad and Tobago's deepwater geology. In the 2 decades since, a series of exploratory ventures have failed to generate commercial quantities of oil. Yet this masquerade of permanence endures. As Energy Minister Kevin Ramnarine opined in 2012, and I quote, "The deep water in Trinidad and Tobago is one of the holy grails of geologists who have long suspected its vast hydrocarbon potential." Alongside a politics of austerity driven by declining production, elite actors and private industry boast the geological features of the deep water to forecast what they see as an imminent recovery in oil and gas production and the permanence of the Trinbagonian petrostate. So sovereignty as an aspirational political ideal involves this pursuit of certainty. In its classical definition by Thomas Hobbes, sovereign power aspires to an absolute and unlimited authority over a commonwealth of subjects. Conversely, though, political anthropologists instruct us to regard all claims to sovereignty as incomplete, as Hansen and Stepetat put it, an emergent form of authority grounded in violence. Ethnographic inquiries into the margins and edges of contemporary state formations have decentered the state as an a priori unit of analysis. Probing moments where this sovereign authority falters, anthropologists of the state regard sovereignty as a fiction of absolute rule that breaks down under empirical scrutiny. This critique, of course, is welcomed by anthropologists of the Caribbean who've long understood state sovereignty to be a fiction that prescribes the political aspirations of both post-colonial nation states and non-sovereign territories in the region. At first glance, this tension between sovereignty as absolute and aspirational appears irreconcilable, or put another way, how can sovereignty at once be real and fictive, total and partial, uniform and dispersed? A resolution to this tension, I think, demands an inquiry into the colonial origins of sovereignty. So in her study of the early modern Atlantic, historian Lauren Benton argues that colonial sovereignty in the Americas did not entail complete territorial control, but instead on the defense of corridors and enclaves stationed across contested geographies of dispossession and imperial warfare. Nevertheless, cartographers represented colonial holdings as coherent geographies with definite borders between settler jurisdictions. In this regard, sovereignty is always sustained by the gestures or bluffs of coherence, in which the speculative map precedes the fortification of territory. Likewise, the Petro-State is a political form in which the unrealized returns of extractive ventures are called upon to confirm a presumptive sovereign authority, like Persard-Besesser in the first slide. Whether these ventures are eventually successful is less important than the work they perform to secure the terms of order in the present. The task of the intellectual, then, is to demonstrate how the speculative narratives crafted by sovereign actors come to be regarded as permanent and absolute. When Persard-Besesser held up 2 jars of crude as harbingers of national progress, she deftly obscured the particulars of fossil fuel extraction and monetization, which include geological surveys, bid rounds, product sharing agreements, extractive technologies, and technical expertise. Instead, the unrealized returns of an offshore discovery appeared certain. So such is the Petro-State Masquerade. As I detail elsewhere in my book, the equation of fossil fuels and sovereign power that's enshrined in the hyphenated clause, the Petro-State, is propped up by what I call masquerades of permanence. In Trinidad, this masquerade surfaces first in the 1930s, when debates raged over the long-term future of the oil industry. While some public figures regarded oil as a wasting asset that would disappear in short order, others insisted that oil was in fact a renewable asset sustained by, and I'm quoting from this newspaper article, a continual process of subterranean chemical action at some indeterminate point between Trinidad and the mainland of Venezuela. By this view, which was espoused by British industrialists, the entire island of Trinidad was destined to be transformed into one large oil city. In the first chapter of my book, I returned to the general strike of 1937, which was sparked by oil field workers in South Trinidad, as an effort by ordinary laborers to disrupt this narrative of permanence through a refusal of wage work that assumes the form of a masquerade of their own. In contrast to the state's masquerade of permanence, this people's masquerade draws on Caribbean Carnivalesque traditions as the foundation of direct democratic expressions of power and working class autonomy. And I just wanted to highlight a bit here that by going back to the archive, and I'll be talking to a group of you about this tomorrow in a workshop, I was able to clarify the terms of this, of the sort of masquerade and the way that I'm mobilizing it in the book. And it was when I was going back to the newspaper archives in the 1930s that I came across these reports that you'll see on the left, it says crowds of strikers parading San Fernando's High Street, singing carnival songs. This is during the strike. They're also singing songs that go, "We ain't working nowhere," and observers said they tended to treat it as carnival time. So I was trying to think about how this masquerade sort of form might then travel. Furthermore, as I detail in chapter 2, this masquerade of permanence resurfaces after political independence in 1962, when post-colonial officials lauded the expansion of extractive resource and heavy metal production to unify a racially and religiously heterogeneous populace. After the Black Power uprising of 1970 registered a formative challenge to what political economist Lloyd Best called Afro-Saxon political hegemony, the People's National Movement of Eric Williams pursued a broad industrialization program to quell insurgent opposition and tighten the party's stronghold on political affairs. The oil boom of 1973 breathed new life into Williams' government and cemented the post-colonial state as a centralized bureaucracy tasked with the management of transnational capital. At moments when colonial and post-colonial sovereignty are unsettled by militant workers and Black Power insurgents, masquerades of permanence were called upon to restore the foundational equation of hydrocarbons and sovereign authority. For instance, where oil was considered a limited and unpredictable resource, Williams championed the expansion of iron and steel facilities, which you see sort of here as bastions of economic stability. In the 1970s, the expansion of the natural gas sector proved essential to the persistence of P&M rule. As a common energy industry aphorism goes, where there's oil, there is gas. So associated natural gas, which occurs as a byproduct of crude oil production, was historically regarded as an undesirable excess, and this was often burned off via gas flares. As a lower value product than crude oil, gas was of negligible import to the colonial economy. But the creation of new uses for natural gas and the discovery of offshore reserves in 1968 inspired the post-colonial government to harness and monetize its abundant gas resources. Invoking its claim to these flared gas resources under the terms of existing production licenses, Williams commissioned 2 compressor platforms to collect associated gas for use in local power generation and a petrochemical sector. So the petrodollar boom in Trinidad financed a program of expansion optimized to natural gas. In addition to its uses as a commercial fuel, natural gas is suited to a range of industrial applications as a combustion fuel for smelting and a feedstock for petrochemical production. As with oil, natural gas development is divided into 3 phases, which are outlined here: the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. The upstream, which is represented on your left, comprises the primary extraction of natural gas in its raw form, which consists principally of methane, or CH4. The midstream involves the processing of methane natural gas through the extraction of natural gas liquids, comprised of higher alkanes such as ethane, C2H6, propane, C3H8, and butane, C4H10. Finally, and most critically, the downstream sector encompasses the production of finished products, including LNG, fertilizers, heavy metals, and petrochemicals, which has really been the backbone of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. In sum, the upstream, midstream, and downstream constitute the value chain in which specialized commodities are produced from unrefined hydrocarbons. Beginning in 1977, the development of iron, steel, and ammonia fertilizer plants laid the foundation for gas-based industrial works in Trinidad at Point Lisas. In the decades that followed, the pursuit of added value through downstream production came to be known as the Trinidad and Tobago model of natural resource management. Under this scheme, the government aimed to diversify its portfolio of investments and lessen its vulnerability to oil price shocks. Yet the nationalist veneer of the model obscured its vulnerability to negative price shocks and international competition. When commodity markets fell in the latter half of the 1980s, for instance, the economy spiraled into recession. This period of structural adjustment inaugurated a shift toward free market principles of liberalization. While downstream developments had arrived with considerable fanfare amidst thriving markets in the 1970s, the ensuing downturn led subsequent governments to divest of these state industrial assets. The strategy of gas-based industrialization, which is intended to promote a diverse and stable portfolio of exports, provided little protection against the cycles of boom and bust. So as export markets for steel and petrochemicals floundered, enterprising state officials began to look elsewhere for opportunities to add value in the downstream. In 1992, a small Massachusetts-based gas distributor named Cabot LNG approached the Trinbagonian government to establish a gas liquefaction facility in the historic oil hub of Point Fortin. In search of additional suppliers to meet seasonal demand for LNG during the winter months in New England, Cabot found willing partners in Amoco and British Gas, then 2 of the principal upstream operators in Trinidad and Tobago. So Train 1 of Atlantic LNG, which emerged as a joint venture of Trinidad's state-owned gas company, Cabot, Amoco, BG, and the Spanish multinational Repsol, came on stream in 1999 and cemented this transition from an oil economy to one principally based in natural gas. And as gas prices and import demand from the US rose precipitously, this project appeared especially timely and judicious. So LNG windfalls continued to pour in, but also natural gas utilization grew more than 5-fold between 1995 and 2007. So just to make this clear, as the downstream grows, you need to find access to more sort of upstream sources of oil or natural gas in this instance. And this started to put pressure on what they were calling the Trinidad and Tobago model. While the LNG project thrived in the short term, the demand for gas feedstock placed added pressure on the upstream sector. By 2010, downstream demand outstripped upstream production and sparked a shortfall in gas supplies that persists up until today. To maintain production, downstream industries needed more gas, with Atlantic LNG running 30% below capacity and in danger of dropping further still. State officials and technocrats touted the lucrative but risk-laden deepwater sector as an area to rejuvenate production. As deepwater thrived globally with the aid of new technologies to drill to ever greater depths of the offshore, Trinidad endured several failed attempts to return a commercial deepwater discovery. See if I can. Okay, no, we're good. As oil and gas prices continued their decline in July 2015, I secured an interview with Kevin D'Souza, a Trinbagonian national and executive of a multinational corporation in Trinidad. After a short but heavily trafficked commute to Port of Spain, I entered the adjoining car park of a popular cinema multiplex. While the storefronts and cinema began to bustle with commercial patrons, the tightly patrolled entrance to the corporate building in the adjoining lot remained conspicuously quiet. When I exited the elevator several floors above, a receptionist extended a friendly welcome and guided me to D'Souza's pristine office overlooking the Caribbean Sea. Following several successful bids for production rights to deepwater acreage in Trinidad, D'Souza's company earned a reputation for its bold investment portfolio in areas of risk and times of market uncertainty. Seated behind a large desk in his corner office, D'Souza briefed me on the strategy to invest heavily in Trinidad, despite a resume of unsuccessful ventures in the deepwater. And as he told me, if you look at the deepwater plays in the Atlantic margin, this is the last deepwater basin. There are 4 major deltaic basins that fuel deepwater in the Atlantic. One is the Niger Delta off of West Africa, and of course that story is already told. The second is the Mississippi Delta, the Gulf of Mexico deepwater, and that story is told. Coming off the Amazon, Brazil deepwater, that story is told. And the deepwater basin that's here as a result of the major river delta in Venezuela, so this is the last one. You look at the 3 others, very, very prolific deepwater basins. You look at Trinidad, it's an established oil and gas province, terrific source rocks, and the possibility of very large reservoirs. Lots of sand coming from the deltas. You know, it's a place to look. Is it high risk? Yes, it is. It's frontier work, but that's the sort of risk that companies like ours take on. So in industry circles, geology is often represented in these narrative terms. To tell the story of a geological province is to survey and exploit its commercial potential. As a frontier region, the untapped acreage of the Trinidadian deepwater presented an opportunity to forge a narrative that would follow the instructive models of earlier developments throughout the circum-Atlantic. The unsuccessful ventures in Trinidad to date were regarded as evidence of its still boundless potential, rather than cautionary reminders of its risks. With the story of Trinidad waiting to enter the annals of industry innovation, the assumption of risk awarded investors the privilege to be the first to the prize that lay in the maritime depths of the eastern Venezuela basin. A compelling story is essential to secure investment in advance of competitive bid rounds for rights to deepwater acreage. A senior geologist who worked in the Ministry of Energy under former Prime Minister Patrick Manning during the first deepwater bid rounds in the 1990s recalled the failed ventures of prior decades and lamented the exceedingly cautious, what she called the exceedingly cautious, drilling programs carried out by Shell, Exxon, and Union Texas. Nevertheless, she regarded a commercial discovery in the deepwater as not simply inevitable, but imminent. And in her words, the day they have a discovery out there, oh my God, people, companies going to rush for it. A lot of them wait for that, yeah? We have the early adopters coming. And when they come, they'll find something and the rest just rushing in. It's like in Ghana when you had Tullow and all these small companies and you had the big ones come in afterwards. It will happen. So I'm assuming that a lot of these people are adopting a wait and see, although BHP has been very bullish. But the development of the resource will go forward as long as they find something. In deepwater exploration, a major find often precipitates a series of subsequent discoveries as multinationals race to adjoining offshore blocks. Again, the Guyana example. Yet the initial find often proves elusive and requires new strategies to secure capital-intensive commitments from investors. Corporate and diplomatic forums provide a staging ground for the production of these geological narratives to entice corporate partners. At the annual Trinidad and Tobago Energy Conference in January of 2015, I joined industry stalwarts, local bureaucrats, and parliamentarians at the Hyatt Regency in downtown Port of Spain for a plenary session entitled Gearing Up for the Deepwater Challenge. Perched at the front of an immaculate meeting room, a petroleum engineer and deepwater advisor for Schlumberger, based in Houston, offered his remarks alongside a map of global deepwater activity displayed on the large projection screen. At first, the map registered only 3 regions as locations of established deepwater plays. They were indicated by oblong areas covering the Gulf of Mexico, the Brazilian coast, and West Africa. As he continued, however, the map lit up with blotches of white and yellow to indicate what he called emerging and frontier areas of deepwater development. And I'm gonna butcher his Texan drawl here, but he said, deepwater is exploding. Everybody's looking for that big elephant, as the map continued to flicker. Despite the litany of failed ventures in the Trinidadian deepwater to date, hope sprang eternal in the estimation of energy technocrats. So after cautioning that his professional background was in engineering and not geology, he prepared to offer the eager audience what he called a little geology 101. And this is a direct quote. So now take a look at this map right here. What do you see as he gestured toward the slide displaying a map of the Southern Atlantic? It looks like a jigsaw puzzle. Don't they kind of fit together? So he's tracing the coastlines of West Africa and Eastern Brazil. And as he continues, now did you know what we're finding here in Brazil? We're finding on the opposite side in Angola. But then for Trinidad, he noted the closest analog was the light oil deposits in the offshore waters of Ghana. So the success of deep water blocks on Ghana's maritime border with Cote d'Ivoire, for him, guaranteed a prosperous future for the Trinbagonian deepwater. So in industry circles, this is called the Atlantic mirror theory, which hypothesizes the existence of large offshore oil deposits in the eastern Venezuela and Guyana-Suriname basins, based on the presence of analogous source rocks in the petroleum systems of West Africa. Geological estimates trace the origins of these petroleum systems on either side of the Atlantic to approximately 90 million years before the present, when the continental landmasses that eventually now constitute Africa and the Americas began to drift apart. So major deepwater finds in French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana from 2011 onward continued to lend supporting evidence to this mirror thesis. So as a major oil discovery eluded daring multinationals, the Trinidadian deepwater necessitates the production of these stories to spark investor hype toward resource frontiers. Likewise, the consolidation of sovereign authority in the Petro-State demands the production of stories to ensure that failures do not preclude further investment. So in energy industry parlance, deepwater production generally refers to extractive ventures at water depths of 1,000 feet or greater. Despite variations in drilling techniques, a broad consensus holds that deepwater plays, which is a shorthand for drilling campaigns, carry exceptional risks. Deepwater ventures are regarded as low probability plays that require massive injections of capital. The cost of a single well often approaches $50 million US and is about 2 orders of magnitude greater than a typical onshore well. The prohibitive costs of deepwater campaigns are exacerbated by the fact that the majority of deepwater wells are dry holes. They return no commercial quantities of oil or gas. Although no extractive play is assured of success, the deepwater requires that investors be equipped to cut dramatic losses for several failed wells in their pursuit of an elusive gusher. Of the 8 deepwater wells drilled in Trinidad between 1999 and 2003, 3 were abandoned due to insufficient commercial quantities of oil and gas. Others were riddled with mechanical troubles or instability that threatened the structural integrity of the well, and adverse ocean currents posed problems in 3 operations conducted by drill ships, which, in comparison to semi-submersible rigs, lack a secure anchoring to the seafloor. So here, the careful selection of infrastructure suited to particular geological profiles dictates the perceived success or failure of a given well. Deepwater drilling campaigns wager extractive technologies against a profile approximated by seismic surveys and expert analysis. So the turn to the deep water, which again is a sort of recent phenomenon in Trinidad compared to its legacy of onshore and conventional production, portends a corresponding turn away from risk mitigation as a hallmark of post-colonial governments characterized by high probability plays, cost-efficient developments, timely state investments, sort of privileging of risk that cedes the practices of the state to these private corporate entities. The election of Prasad-Bissessar in 2010 inaugurated reforms to the fiscal regime that governs the offshore to encourage investment in frontier areas, special provisions, decrease the petroleum profit tax from 50% to 35% for deepwater production specifically. So while the deepwater was yet to produce any returns, its lucrative geology continued to be invoked as the spoils to be won through these policies of economic liberalization. So no longer was oil or gas a timely resource to sow judiciously prior to its eventual exhaustion. Fossil fuels were presented once again as limitless resources waiting to be unearthed with the aid of innovative extractive technologies. So we can think also about this masquerade of permanence as being different in content but not in form than the earlier slide that I presented about the 1930s, that where they were speculating about this subterranean process that would continue to renew hydrocarbons beneath the seafloor. Here we see, again, sort of permanence being invoked again, even if they're not using the same kind of scientific claims to back it up. When I returned to D'Souza, he echoed this sentiment when he traced the steps from initial investment to first oil and gas. As he said, at the end of the day, Ryan, what we have is data. We've got to convert that into the best information we can get. We have to have the best people, which we do, interpreting this data and trying to find the best locations for us to drill in an area that's 5 times the size of Trinidad. So it's not like we're playing in a little place. This is a massive area we're exploring, and it'll come down to drilling wells. At the end of the day, we look at all sorts of data and everything else, but we have to drill the well. And when we drill the well, that's when we'll know. Still, he made me no assurances. Instead, he enumerated the risks and cost margins that accompany deepwater plays. These are massive projects, he mused. These are not small projects. These deepwater things are enormous investments. In many instances, it's difficult even for large private enterprises to do on their own. Echoing their partners in the private sector, state functionaries pin their hopes to multinational investment on the deepwater frontier. As oil and gas markets continued to contract in the early months of 2015, I turned to a reservoir engineer who had left the state oil company Petro-Trin in search of a sober assessment. He assured me that the failed ventures in the deepwater were to be expected. That's what exploration is. Before we started to get all these finds in the shallow water, it was like that. We were exploring. We might get something, we may not get something. And normally the standard is you might drill 7 wells dry hole before you get 1 good well. That's the standard if you look at the Gulf of Mexico standard. So basically we've drilled about 7 or 8 in the deep water, right? We could probably in the next phase really hit something. So I wouldn't say it's due to our work or anything. It's just exploration, and that is what it is. He tempered a disheartening resume of unsuccessful developments. After the fiscal reforms that were installed by Prasad-Bissessar's administration, the government accepted bids for several deepwater blocks from BP, BHP, BG, all the major oil companies, reversing the fortunes of previous unsuccessful bid rounds and declining multinational interests. Per his calculus, Trinidad was due for a significant windfall, yet his sanguine temperament registered unevenly against more than a decade of unsuccessful drilling. Again, the deepwater is distinguished from other plays by risk, cost, and time. Deepwater ventures are characteristically long cycle plays that span more than a decade from initial discovery to full production. By extension, the temporality of deepwater production precipitates another temporality of governance. Rather than upholding expectations of stability, deepwater plays operate unabashedly under a speculative register in which discoveries hold the potential to restore periods of economic prosperity and state-sponsored social welfare. So in contrast to a prior impulse in the post-independence period of economic prosperity and state-sponsored social welfare, in contrast to a prior impulse that purported to abate the depletion of reserves through this diversified portfolio of investments, advances in extractive technologies award the oil and gas sector an aura of interminability. In contrast to the short cycles of conventional and shale production, this protracted period spent at play in deepwater exploration generates anticipation of an imminent commercial success. The time of deepwater plays provides the fodder for the distinct performances and masquerades of statesmen and corporate actors alike. So while oil and gas are by definition non-renewable resources, the proliferation of new extractive technologies to access previously inaccessible reserves now seems to ensure that the threat of peak oil will continue to steadily fade into the backdrop, as seemingly ethereal substances that are metonymic of money, modernity, and development. Oil and gas fuel bureaucratic and populist ambitions alike. And in doing so, they divert attention from the troubling realities of dry wells, unstable drill ships, and disinterested multinationals. So in September 2015, Dr. Keith Rowley, who's pictured at center in this checkered shirt, assumed the office of Prime Minister in Trinidad after the PNM reclaimed a majority of seats in Parliament. As the People's Partnership dissolved amidst reports of corruption that his predecessor, Prasad Bissessar, had vowed to eradicate, the PNM orthodoxy returned to power as voters reverted to conventionally racialized blocs. A geologist by training and a longtime parliamentary representative for Diego Martin West, I should add, Rowley is also the second geologist to serve as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Rowley maintained an ambitious approach to the energy sector. During a visit to an offshore drill ship with BHP officials, this is pictured here, Rowley spoke confidently of the hydrocarbon sector as the lifeblood of the country and lauded the deepwater as a strategy to stem the fiscal tides. Still, he was forthright in his assessment of deepwater prospects. Although he understood the technical capabilities of the drill ship, equipped to drill to depths of 40,000 feet, he cautioned that the venture would accrue operational costs in excess of $1.2 million US per day. He placed the costs in perspective, estimating that the campaign would last approximately 80 days in total, and conceded, and I quote, "You can understand why those with deep pockets are the ones who could go into deep water, because after that well, God forbid that hole is dry." At first glance, the geologist Rowley acknowledged the possibility that the drilling program would mark yet another commercial failure. But he wasn't ready to abdicate an exalted Trinbagonian geology. Appealing to the spiritual inclinations of a religiously diverse populace, he added, "So we as a praying people will have to keep our fingers crossed that as we face this new province, we will be successful in finding oil and gas." Offering a reflection on the troubles of the deepwater, Rowley followed his predecessor in his effort to stir faith in deepwater futures. In August 2016, BHP announced the results of the first well of its deepwater campaign off the east coast of Trinidad. After he had visited the Deepwater Invictus drill ship in June, the Leclerc well was projected as a potential gusher holding in excess of 5 billion barrels of oil. Contrary to expectations, the well did not return an oil find. Although it yielded significant quantities of gas-bearing sands, the more opulent oil discovery failed to materialize when pressure control difficulties halted drilling at a depth greater than 22,000 feet. The aftershocks of this unsuccessful drilling campaign reverberated onshore. In March 2016, the Luxembourg-based multinational, ArcelorMittal, shuttered its steel plant after persistent concerns over gas supply and sent more than 600 workers to the breadline. By November 2018, the state-owned Petro-Trinidad oil refinery shut down indefinitely after more than 100 years of continuous operation as its debt ballooned following a decline in domestic oil production. According to oil field workers' trade union estimates, nearly 10,000 permanent and contract laborers were retrenched. The massive productive potential of the deepwater again presented a convenient register to remedy the crisis. In the summer months of 2020, the oil and gas industry reeled under COVID-19 price shocks. Commodity markets collapsed as the pandemic reduced consumer demand for fuel. Spot prices in shale regions of Texas' Permian Basin briefly turned negative as futures contracts came due and fossil fuel storage infrastructures filled to capacity. So again, if you had this storage capacity, they would pay you to take the oil off of their hands. On September 20th, 2020, Rowley and his energy minister, Franklin Kahn, staged a press conference at the Diplomatic Center in St. Anne's, Trinidad, to announce the results of BHP's exploratory broadside well in the TTDAA3 deepwater block. That August, the Invictus arrived on Trinidad's maritime border with Guyana to begin a drilling program in partnership with Shell. Flanked by banners for the Ministry of Energy and BHP, Rowley and Khan wore protective masks as they sat beside a long table alongside BHP Trinidad and Tobago President Vincent Pereira. The global vice president of exploration for BHP joined via Zoom from Houston. The staging of this masquerade, carefully curated across borders through digital communications technologies and a cast of industry experts, came to life via live stream. Khan opened his remarks with cautious optimism. And I quote, "Today's ceremony is in recognition of the future of the energy sector that lies in our deepwater province. No production has come on stream from the deepwater blocks. However, there have been exploration successes which have added to the country's natural gas reserves. In the medium and long term, these exploration successes will manifest in hydrocarbon production." Khan then ceded the floor to Rowley to fet the commencement of this new drilling program. In a rare display of vulnerability, Rowley conceded that the presence of BHP in the Trinidad oil and gas market had not always been guaranteed. Instead of reading at length, I'm actually going to play this section for you. So let me see if the audio is cooperating.
WA14. In between the first and second phases of drilling, I visited Australia in May 2018, where I met with the senior executives at BHP in Melbourne. There we discussed in detail BHP's continued investment and presence in Trinidad and Tobago. I impressed upon them the mutual benefits to both Trinidad and Tobago and BHP of this deepwater exploration program. We both agreed and were committed to this success. This visit was important because it was a time when BHP was rolling back its presence internationally and was moving back to its core business. And we here in Trinidad and Tobago were in some danger of being left out of the new BHP expenditure program. And the competition for investment funds was such that there was no guarantee that this exploratory and pioneering work in Trinidad and Tobago would have continued in the way it is continuing now. However, as a geologist, I genuinely believe what the minister has just said. Maybe we geologists are over-optimistic, but it's our profession looking into the earth, that we remain an area of significant hydrocarbon potential, and the provenance which Trinidad and Tobago lay claim to is an area which is still exciting for geological exploration. I'm pleased that those discussions in Melbourne resulted in the decisions to continue to invest significantly in these pioneering works in Trinidad and Tobago. Today we are one of the few areas in the world where such exploration is taking place in the deep water, especially in the new deep water zones. The government gave BHP the commitment that we would do all that is necessary to facilitate the success of the program by amending the various production sharing contracts where appropriate to ensure exploration success.
So I also wanted you all to see visually what some of these masquerades look like. And they actually look quite mundane. If you zoomed out, you would see it's just a typical sort of hotel ballroom. And they were seated at a pretty plain looking table. But this is a really telling anecdote, in part because he concedes a section of this masquerade, right? So BHP, which is an Australian mining multinational, had only expanded in recent decades from its trademark investments in minerals and ores to operations in upstream oil and gas. And Trinidad is one of its signature investments, along with Brazil. As BHP weighed its options to divest from hydrocarbons and reaffirm its traditional mining interests, Rowley traveled to Melbourne to preserve the partnership on which the future of the deepwater firmly rested. He validated this conviction with his professional expertise. As a geologist, he testified to the promising qualities of Trinidad's deepwater prospects. His desperate plea to BHP in Melbourne preserved his authority for the time being, but it also revealed that the location of Trinbagonian sovereignty rested in Melbourne and also in London and Houston as much as it did in the capital city of Port of Spain. BHP, BP, and Shell, as the sort of largest upstream investors in Trinidad, held the power to declare a state of exception as much as Rowley himself. But his masquerade still did not stop. Trouble ensued. Mere days after Rowley's hopeful appraisal, the crew stationed on the Invictus drillship detected a stuck pipe that brought drilling to a halt. When drilling did resume, greater tragedy struck when the well failed to return commercial qualities of hydrocarbons. I probably sound like a broken record at this point. Broadside 1 returned another dry hole. While the local press and international business media published reports on the Broadside 1 well, the Diplomatic Center, pictured here, did not play host to a press conference of the same fanfare. By commemorating the launch of a deepwater campaign, Rowley and Kahn played a masquerade. As Kahn surmised, there's a saying in the exploration circles that the only way to find oil and gas is to drill. By hailing the unprecedented depths of the exploration program, the moment of drilling masqueraded as a commercial success. After another failed venture, faith in the miracle of deepwater hydrocarbons did not subside. Kahn chided the multinationals for what he called their reluctance to undertake deep drilling to go after oil. As he's had it, success was inevitable if only they dared to go deeper. So again, to return to this theme, the miracle is the foundation of state sovereignty if we understand it via someone like Hobbes and perhaps sort of his latter day elaborators like Carl Schmitt. Some have interpreted Thomas Hobbes' commentary as a cautionary posture toward miracles, as a threat toward political stability. A careful reading of his Leviathan, though, validates miracles as an essential feature of sovereign power. Hobbes turns to the biblical narrative of Exodus to distinguish between the deceptive enchantments of the magicians in the Pharaoh's court and divinely ordained miracles performed by Moses. Rather than necessitating the abolition of miracles, Hobbes's ideal sovereign defines the limits of the miraculous in order to establish the terms of political order. Tracing the foundation of sovereign absolutism to Hobbes' Christian incantation in Leviathan, Jesus is the Christ, Carl Schmitt reminds us that the practice of sovereignty is only held together by the acceptance of the miracle as its foundation. The miracle is that which renders the uncertain returns of the play as a preordained success. Not unlike the colonial cartographer who demands that the aspirational technology of the map be accepted as a perfect representation of settler jurisdiction, Schmitt insists that sovereignty is a theological exercise in which the authority of the sovereign determines what subjects of the state have to believe to be a miracle. And again, remember that Schmitt likens the state of exception to the miracle in theology. While the Caribbean is often derided as a political geography of weak states and incomplete sovereignties, the state form persists as a political ideal against insurgent clamors for direct democratic futures. As Rolf Trio reminds us, it's in the Caribbean where the hyphenated relation of the nation state is thrown out of joint. In Trinidad, this hyphenated form of the Petro-State is likewise sustained by a masquerade of permanence that prophesizes the speculative futures of oil and gas production as predestined by its divine geology. The Caribbean is not defined by its failure to adhere to the prescriptions of state sovereignty, but by its testimony to the enduring reliance on the production of miracles to resolve a gap between the purported omnipotence of sovereign actors and their fragile hold on political authority. We may have seen this also in recent weeks here in the seat of empire. So this is where the miracle is laid bare as the foundation of sovereignty itself. The future of the deep water must be certain, sovereignty must be absolute, God must be a Trinity. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Doubly
taking questions.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. There's many questions that can come out of this. I'm only going to do one. Like, for example, you could talk about Catherine Youssef's decolonial critique of the science of geology and how that applies to the Trinidad and Tobago scenario. But I wanted to ask about mainly to do with the global value chain and the use of the term Petro-State and conceptualizing it, just in terms of these national modes of natural gas extraction, and considering your focus on the state, how deep is the state's involvement? You mentioned a New England company and British Gas, etc., but being careful not to homogenize petrostates. Let's say, for example, how this model is totally unfamiliar to Saudi, the UAE, and Gaddafi's Libya, for example. I just sort of want to interrogate that and see how you're using the term petrostate in the Trini scenario, and how that can't be extended to lots of other stereotypical or, the normally imagined petrostates, because you're making a lot of arguments that come from political ecology, for example, about territorialization and using Hobbes' sovereignty, but then there's questions about how using Hobbes extends when you're actually using private enterprises. But I'll leave it there and sort of excited for your response.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. My argument is that we can sort of extend this model of the Petro-State Masquerade beyond Trinidad's shores, right? I think in some ways, by virtue of being a small place, or what I call in the prologue, a big small place. It's large for the Caribbean, but it's small in the world of, sort of petrostates, as you're saying. I think what's revealing about Trinidad is that the masquerade is not nearly as successful, right? This masquerade of permanence in Saudi Arabia, for instance, or the Emirates, hasn't had any occasion to be questioned. Right? That the equation of, again, fossil fuels and political power is quite strong. So what I'm trying to think about is this inevitable? Again, sort of we think about a lot of the literature on resource curse or Dutch disease. Are these things inevitable? Are they innate to the commodity and the resource? Or does that have something to do with the way that we understand various kinds of political and economic arrangements? So I think that my hope, again, is that this allows us to view the petrostate differently, that where we can only see sort of spectacle and success in other theaters, again, and I think a lot of the sort of paradigmatic studies of petrostates have understandably come from these other places, right? I think Trinidad allows us to access this in a different way. And I think that Rowley is so telling, again, sort of he and his predecessor as the political leader of the PNM are both geologists, right? And this is to say that in a place like Trinidad that's had more than a century of commercial oil and gas production, this becomes key to the kinds of political repertoires that folks wield in the electoral arena and in various kinds of sort of repertoires of public address. That he's drawing on his expertise. He's drawing on this profile as a oil and gas expert in order to validate that, again, his forecast, his masquerade will indeed be successful. So I'm committed to thinking about, for instance, now particularly the United States is a net exporter of oil and gas once again, right? We can think about the ways that these masquerades are taken up here. We can think about the way that, for instance, 8 years ago, the sort of masquerade of resuscitating a coal economy became central to election narratives. And I think various kinds of resource nostalgia prove quite effective in a variety of different theaters, whether or not they actually return. So again, that's sort of what we're mapping here, that to be successful in Trinbagonian politics is to always remain faithful about the ability for the oil and gas sector to sort of experience a renaissance, right? That it's drawing on these sort of affective ties to the industry that have been built over, again, more than 100 years. So I really want to think about perhaps, and again, what would it mean to take seriously the Saudis as a masquerade, right? How do they assert their legitimacy and permanence? I certainly think that this is something they're doing, otherwise they wouldn't be buying football clubs all over the world to try to, and bringing in celebrities in order to try to improve their diplomatic profile. Clearly there's some anxiety there, right, that has to be satisfied. So again, I think that this is what the gift of doing research in a so-called small place, a so-called peripheral place, allows us to access. So it's actually my hope that we could think about how this would elaborate to these other sites as well. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really fascinating. Similar kind of question, I guess, in a similar kind of comparative question. I was thinking about Coronil's magical state throughout the talk. And your answer kind of elaborates on maybe what you're doing differently. I just want you to say more about that difference. I suppose one of them, it seems like for Coronil, there's a kind of terrestrial story which involves landowners and rent that produces a highly centralized state. And this is deepwater that maybe necessitates multinational cooperation and a kind of more fissured sovereignty, or I don't know, maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I actually got this exact same question, it probably won't surprise you, at the University of Michigan, where Coronil had spent several decades. And also it's something that's always been on the back of my mind with this project. So when I was applying to graduate school back in 2011, to date myself, one of the programs I considered was anthropology at CUNY, where Fernando was. And we met, we talked about the project. I ended up going to Yale, and tragically, Fernando passed away the following September. He hadn't even been diagnosed when I met him in March, but he died of lung cancer. So I've sat with that book through this entire process. Not just because it is such a formative contribution to the scholarship in anthropology on petrostates, but also, if we go back, I probably didn't mention, Trinidad is 7 miles from Venezuela at the closest point. This is the same geology, and it's only an accident of geological history, really of sea level rise, that then separated Trinidad from what is now Venezuela. So all of that just to say, I'm always thinking about the kind of dialectic between these two geographies. And I think a lot of that has to do with size. Again, sort of for a long time, Venezuela's masquerade was quite successful because it could claim a kind of monopoly on the hydrocarbon resources of the eastern Venezuela basin. It continues to have the largest oil reserves in the world. But as we see here, it's a lot more complicated to get those reserves out of the ground. It does require multinational cooperation. And in fact, the Venezuelan state did not have a complete monopoly, right? That they weren't able to do this alone. And we're seeing the kind of effects of the withdrawal of multinationals, the sort of extension of sanctions on that masquerade. And I think also Fernando's later writings on Chavez and on the sort of limits of Chavez populism that was based on extractive rents and revenues speaks to this. So I've always been thinking about sort of where his work would have gone, because the magical state is exalting, again, sort of what oil can do to suture the petrostate, to suture the two sides of the petrostate as a hyphenated relation. And I was always curious what he would have continued to write, particularly now, again, sort of thinking about sort of the Venezuelan situation now, that also has been a boon to Guyana, for instance, which also shares the same geology. And now multinationals have, conveniently said, if we don't have to go through Venezuela anymore, instead we can go to Georgetown, and we could find our way, we can go to Paramaribo, and that way we can also access the same geological resources. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, except to say that I hope that this is the sort of represents the best of what Fernando would have said about this political moment, as opposed to the moment that he was doing that work in the 80s and 90s, right? And I think, again, the sort of expanded geography of fossil fuels, which I've written about quite a lot, that there are new players in this game, whether it's Equatorial Guinea, whether it's Guyana, that has fundamentally changed the map. And I don't mean that, facetiously, but has changed the map in ways that have also changed the way we apprehend this conversation from that moment. So yeah, I hope this represents the best of what he would have done. And that's if I've done that, then I've been successful.
Thank you so much for your talk. This isn't my area of research, and this isn't what I'm familiar with, but as you were speaking about sovereignty, resource extraction, and this masquerade, I was thinking of Scottish nationalism, and particularly independence, right? So when they were going through the independence, when they were being questioned as, well, how are you going to survive as a small country in Europe, you know, outside of the European Union, perhaps? And they said, well, we've got oil, we've got gas. And it wasn't really interrogated in the same way, but it became this, as you mentioned, this projection that voided critique. And so to extend Ray's question, I'm just wondering about, although this was focused on this, as you said, this small place, how comparativist were you in your analysis that led you to get to this theory that you've made? And my second question that I'm a bit more familiar with is, you mentioned on the one page we did archival research, the one, this one.
This one.
I was wondering about your methods in terms of archive. So, for instance, you highlighted those two sections, and you were presenting this as an argument. This is evidence that supports the masquerade. What a lot of Black Atlantic scholars have done is, rather than showing kind of what exists, they actually show what isn't there, and they use that to theorize. But here, you showed us what's there, and I'm wondering what things that weren't there that you used to theorize.
Both fantastic questions. I'm excited to answer the second one, but I'll start with the first. I wouldn't say that I did comparativist work, which I would say is also, that's by virtue of my training in anthropology. It's not common for us. But this is a great example. Again, all of the campaigns, the Scottish independence campaign, "It's Scotland's oil" was the tagline. And I've built a conversation with my colleague Ewan Gibbs, who's in Glasgow, who's written, again, about the sort of decline of the coal industry in Scotland. And we actually had an exchange recently after the book announcement went out. And he was saying, well, we need to get you out to Glasgow because people are grappling with refinery closures and mine closures and what it means affectively, right? It's both economic, but it's also affective, that people have sort of staked their sense of personhood, their sense of masculinity, for instance, to these industries. And we've been talking about sort of building a conversation across these two because, in talking to him, we realize how many resonances there are between these geographies. And I think there are many, again, elsewhere who are sort of grappling with the same question that also relates to how do we narrate and articulate the so-called energy transition, right? Like what is required that goes beyond the technical side and the economic side, but also how do we understand these enduring attachments to something like petroleum or something like coal, which is to say that this masquerade isn't just something that state officials are using to dupe unwitting citizens. They're drawing on and appealing to long-standing sort of histories of working class organization and uplift, right? That this is the beginning of, in 1937, workers seeing oil as a pathway of economic opportunity and particularly of sort of moving into the middle class for predominantly Black Trinidadians, right? So they continue to draw on this memory and these affective ties to the industry. That's what makes the masquerade so successful. To your latter question, I could go on about methods all day. Again, I was always regarded as kind of odd in my own graduate training because I spent so much time in archives. And interestingly, again, this was a more ethnographic chapter, but for me, it's critically important, one, to always dwell with what the archive offers us first. I think there was a tendency, particularly when I was in graduate school, that students around me were always in a rush to talk about silences in the archive before we had actually gone to the archive. And I was mentioning to Adriana earlier, the very first week of my graduate training, we were assigned sort of a collection of essays on the archive by Hazel Carby. And she said it doesn't matter sort of what discipline you are coming from, it's critical that you go to the archive and you regard it, critically, again, as sort of a repository of colonial knowledge, but there also is a lot, so let's look at these two again, that there's both the sort of bombast of the colonial vision, right? That this is unlimited, it's going to continue to reproduce itself, as dubious as this claim may have been. And then here, again, these are still colonial transcripts by like one of the organs of planter elites, but it reveals something really telling, right? We can never know the interiority of, you know, who was it that started this song, or what did they mean by it, or what did they desire? And I think that that is a sort of valid critique that many scholars have launched against the archive, right? But, and I wouldn't say that what I'm doing is any kind of sort of critical fabulation in the sort of Hartman sense, but it's really to say that through these traces, and I think I would say I'm more gestural than I am trying to fill in the gaps. Singing a song that says "we ain't working nowhere" is making a particular kind of claim, both about the nature of the strike and also about a broader vision of working class self-emancipation, which is also sort of validated in other sources. So just to say, you know, I spent a lot of time both in, these are microfilm newspaper archives at the University of the West Indies. There is a treasure trove of documents in the Colonial Office records in London, including the entire sort of sedition trial transcript of Uriah Butler, who was a oil worker turned evangelical preacher who was seen as the leader of the strike, even though the strike happened without him prompting it. And in that transcript, he rehearses from memory like hours-long speeches that he gave to ordinary workers at these revival meetings. So again, it's like if we're creative, there's actually a lot that we can recover. And I think for me, I'm hesitant again toward that impulse to fill in the gaps. But I think that there's enough there that we actually could start to assemble what was the kind of political vision that was on display in 1937 in Trinidad. I'll say one last thing on this. I know I said I could talk all day about this. C.L.R. James, who Adriana mentioned in her introduction, C.L.R. James gave a memorial address for Uriah Butler, the leader of the strike, when he passed away in 1977. And he says something that I find to be really profound, where he says that, you know, Butler, I never knew him to preach Marxism, right? And he says preach, because he was a preacher, right? I think you would also add to that, we never knew that he read Marx. But one of the statements that Butler makes in this trial, he says that the emancipation of the working class can only come about by virtue of the working class themselves. And James says, well, that's a very Marxist statement, right? How does he arrive at that? It completely sort of rescripts the way that we think of, again, sort of the party vanguard, the sort of relationship between theory and praxis, because there were socialists at this moment in Trinidad in 1937 who had to acknowledge that actually Butler was way ahead of them, even though he wasn't the one reading, he was just reading a Bible, right? So I think this calls into question in a lot of ways just how we understand the relationship between, again, sort of theory and praxis, and that's all there in the archive. A lot of folks have written about this strike, but I've never seen folks sort of meditate on these moments in the archive, particularly around the Carnivalesque, and also around sort of what the sort of theory of working class self-emancipation that was present. So all that is really just an entreaty, like, please go to the archive, no matter where your research is based, because you will have sort of profound discoveries, even as we acknowledge the limits of the archive. There are sort of profound and critical material that's there. So yes, that's my soapbox speech, and I'll leave it there.
Hi. So you mentioned some effective connections to oil that you were just talking about, connection to masculinity, so on. And I was thinking about post-colonial nationalism when you were showing that picture of Eric Williams. And so I was confused because it seemed like you were talking about a kind of different veneer of this masquerade that appears under a kind of black national Petro-State Masquerade. And so versus kind of this very kind of common veneer, which is very neoliberal. And, you know, Eric Williams is one of the kind of champions of a different type of economic, you know, world structure and how, you know, post-colonial countries are part of that. So I just wanted you to speak more to like this Black nationalist Petro-State Masquerade under Eric Williams, and how it exists a little bit differently than the one that we're experiencing today.
Yeah. So you're going to get me to make another soapbox speech here, which is that there's this strange phenomenon in the US Academy that seems to think that Eric Williams was a socialist. He did write a book called Capitalism and Slavery that is well regarded. I can get it, we can talk about that part in the, at the reception perhaps. But during the 1970 Black Power uprising, which was against Williams, one, he banned his own book, and he had a secret police force that was actively murdering Black teenagers and dissidents. So he was trying to put down this rebellion, right? And part of the argument I make in the book is that in the sort of late colonial period, as the anti-colonial movement is moving behind Williams, these two masquerades converge. His state masquerade and the People's Masquerade are actually together. They're marching on the US military base in Chaguaramas. They're demanding its return. They're together. And after independence, they begin to fracture and move apart, in part because he's now embracing a technocratic vision of post-colonial development. We wouldn't call it neoliberal at this point because the state is still seeing itself as sort of an interventionist or sort of entrepreneurial role within this. You know, there's the National Oil Company. These are sort of state-directed investments based on oil and gas revenues coming out of the oil boom. But all of this was, you know, he was successful in putting down a rebellion that was really at his door. There was an army mutiny in 1970 and that nearly overthrew his government. They said that he fainted in his office when he heard about it. And what C.L.R. James says, who again was his mentor, and then they sort of parted ways, was that, you know, Williams wasn't any kind of political genius. It's the oil saved him. So the last thing I'll say is that in 1973, right before as we know, this sequence of events that led to the dramatic rise in oil prices as a result of the so-called the oil weapon triggered by OPEC states and protest of Israel, Williams had announced his retirement. And he said there are guerrillas in the hills, and, you know, basically he tried to condemn them, but he said, like, I'm done with politics. 3 months later, after, you know, oil prices quadruple, suddenly he says, never mind, I'm back in office. I'm gonna be leading the masquerade again. So Eric Williams is it's so interesting the difference between the way Williams is viewed in Trinidad versus in the States. And again, I think it is because of this text that he wrote, which again, I think, you know, we can think about this in the terms of the masquerade. Like, what does it mean to ban your own book and say that this is dangerous and shouldn't be read at the university? I think in some ways that's a perfect foil for post-colonial statecraft and leadership in general. And I think this is also, strangely enough, what sort of C.L.R. James is getting at in the Black Jacobin. So this is something that emerges as early as 1801 in the Black radical tradition of the sort of the post-colonial leader who begins to turn his back on the masses. So that's my shorter answer. We could talk about it more at the reception because, again, it's another thing I could talk about all day. So thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you. Join me one more time in thanking Dr. Jobson.
Thank you.